Hello, I'm Dr. Bob Bartlett. In this session, we are going to discuss oxygen toxicity. In the history section, we learned that Priestley, Lavoisier, and others had expressed concerns that oxygen, although beneficial as a drug, may have a darker side. Now, oxygen toxicity encompasses a number of different phenomena in terms of the central nervous system, the pulmonary system, and others. And I'd like to begin this session with a quote from Dr. Priestley, who was credited with the discovery of oxygen. We may also infer from these experiments that pure oxygen may be very useful as a medicine, but might not be so proper for use in the healthy state of the body. For as a candle burns out much faster in oxygen than in common air, so we might, as might be said, live out too fast and the animal powers be too soon exhausted in this pure kind of air. Said in the language of the day, it was an accurate prediction of what would become the cornerstone of aging theory. Why is it we grow old? Today, we know that oxygen is a part of the problem. You see, everything on this planet is burning. It may not be burning at the rate of this building, but oxidation is an inevitable part of life on this earth. And although we think of oxygen as a beneficent gas, it is also oxygen that has the power to unleash the chemistry that makes life possible. Consider for a moment buying a new car. You park the car in your garage. You leave it for 10 years. You never even drive it. Examine the car 10 years later. You find the hoses are stiff, the upholstery is cracking, and that is an inanimate object. Now consider for a moment something as delicate and complex as a human cell with its trilipid membrane. And you really begin to appreciate, nay, even marvel at the fact that life can exist in what is an extraordinarily hostile environment. 21% oxygen, enormously corrosive, perhaps even explosive. So oxygen is truly a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it has the power to unleash an enormous amount of chemical energy, but that same power also poses significant biological challenges. Now, the mechanisms for oxygen toxicity are based on the production of oxygen-free radicals, and clearly we have developed cellular defenses. Now, let me take a moment here to explain what exactly is an oxygen-free radical. We talk about free radicals in chemistry as O2 dot minus. And what that means, it signifies, is that the oxygen molecule has an extra electron. And on a chemical level, what that means is it is extraordinarily reactive. It has an itch that's got to be scratched. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detailed chemistry because for most people in the clinical arena, it's probably not of great deal of interest. But it is important. It is important that you understand the basis for this enormous reactivity. Now, if we think about the ways that oxygen is transported, it is basically transported to the tissues by two predominant pathways. We have the oxygen that's bound to hemoglobin, and this is actually a legitimate chemical bond. It's not a covalent bond, but it is an electrostatic bond. And then we have the oxygen that is dissolved in plasma. Now, if one reflects on what hemoglobin really does, it provides a very efficient platform to deliver oxygen to the tissues. However, if you're a toxicologist, your position would actually be that hemoglobin is a very powerful antidote. It functions almost like EDTA, ethylene diamine tetraacetate. So if we have a person with lead poisoning or arsenic poisoning, we know that EDTA chelates those specific elements, lead and arsenic. And hemoglobin, in a similar fashion, also chelates or binds oxygen, enveloping it, protecting us from this destructive potential. On the other hand, the oxygen that's dissolved in the plasma is precisely the oxygen that is chemically available and chemically labile. Now, of these two pools, the one that we manipulate the most in hyperbaric therapy is not the oxygen bound to hemoglobin, because under normal conditions, we're already at about 99 or 100% saturated. The pool that we change the most is the physically dissolved, precisely the pool that is chemically available and chemically so reactive. Now, the biological costs of these free radicals would be the following. We have membrane disruption, protein inactivation, impaired electron transport, and yes, even DNA and RNA damage. You know, we live in a rather amazing age. Our generation has seen two of the greatest achievements that will stand for all time. Number one is it was this generation that saw the actual discovery of DNA, Watson and Crick, and how we move information from generation to generation. And within this same generation, we have actually mapped the human genome. And with this mapping has come a revelation and an understanding of the concepts as to why it is we age. We know that DNA is constantly damaged every day through these oxidative mechanisms. And each time it's damaged, it's repaired, damaged and repaired. But eventually, we lose some fidelity in the code. It's kind of like making a photocopy of a copy of a copy, and sooner or later somebody says, hey, can you get me a clean copy? So this is sort of what is occurring at that level. Now, I don't mean to suggest that any of your patients will emerge from the hyperbaric chamber suddenly growing a 6-digit or some kind of mutation. But certainly every day we do see membrane disruption, protein inactivation. Now, of course, we have evolved various cellular defenses to contain these problems. For example, there is enzymes like superoxide dismutase, catalase, and peroxidases that help to bust or dissolve these free radicals. Then there are molecular scavengers, glutathione, vitamin C, vitamin E. You know, Linus Pauling had a great deal of fascination in vitamin C, and it wasn't so much about the common cold as it was the recognition that ascorbate was a powerful scavenger of oxygen radicals in the aqueous phase. In a similar fashion, vitamin E is a powerful scavenger in the lipid phase. And we know that animals, small rodents, kept on very unusual diets high in glutathione, vitamin C, selenium, resveratrol, vitamin E, and so on, have more than doubled their lifespans. Now, it may be some time before we can translate these findings into the human experience, but nonetheless, these molecular scavengers play an important role in normal physiology. And then finally, there's the actual organization of the cell itself, compartmentalization. If you think about the energetics of the cell, most of all the high energy reactions occur within organelles. That is to say, the P450 system, the mitochondria, and so on. If you look at low energy reactions, things like the Embden-Meyerhof pathway, the fermentation of glucose, where do those enzymes exist? Well, they exist in the cytosol, just floating around. So we see this level of organization where we have these organelles almost like little crucibles containing the cellular fires of this extremely reactive environment. Now, these free radicals oftentimes beget second-generation radicals. That is to say, a superoxide radical most likely would react to the cell membrane, rich in fatty acids, producing lipid peroxides. So we view oxygen as a drug. And as a drug, its responsible use requires familiarity with the dosing and adverse side effects. Naturally, the body has a wide range of safety for the use of oxygen, but given sufficient amounts of oxygen, we can eventually wear down or overwhelm these potent antioxidant defense mechanisms. So what are the manifestations of oxygen toxicity? Well, they come in three broad categories. We have CNS effects, central nervous system, pulmonary, and ocular. The Baer effect, as we learned in our history session, is attributed to Dr. Baer, the father of high-pressure physiology. And he noticed that breathing oxygen at 3 ATA could result in grand mal seizures. We could also, in a similar fashion, talk about the Smith effect. This is a reflection of the fact that if we breathe pure oxygen for a continuous period of time, we will ultimately injure the lung. So let's look more closely at the CNS effects of oxygen toxicity. If we look at the relationship between the inspired gas pressure and time, it has this curve, which in math we call a hyperbolic function. Now the asymptote on this function, that is the lower line where it's almost flat, occurs at 2 ATA. That is to say, at 2 ATA, you could breathe oxygen for hours without developing any CNS effects. On the other hand, as soon as you leave that pressure, you'll see that the interval becomes very, very short. This is one of the reasons why later we will talk about the need for air breaks to give a momentary break from pure oxygen, and you'll come to learn that most authorities recommend the use of air breaks at pressures higher than 2 ATA. Again, looking at the graph here, we see that 2 ATA, most people can breathe this for hours without fear of CNS effects. Here's an interesting study looking at oxygen toxicity. In this study, we have divers that are being exposed to 3.7 ATA. You might recognize that that already exceeds the toxic limit of 3 because the investigators specifically intended to make these individuals toxic. Now, as you examine the distribution, you recognize that some people became symptomatic in as little as 10 minutes. On the other hand, some could go as long as an hour and a half. So as you reflect on this, you would say, gee, that is biological variability. And let's just do a little clinical correlation. Let's say, armed with this information, you have a patient who has been receiving hyperbaric therapy for the last 20 treatments. And they have done completely well. And then suddenly, on the 21st treatment, bam, they have an oxygen seizure. You say, what happened? The fact that they've had 20 sessions a month of hyperbaric therapy without any problems might lead you to believe that they were extremely tolerant of oxygen. The explanation as to what happened is in the next slide here. Here is a single individual who was treated over 90 days with 20 dives. And you'll notice the extraordinary variability from day to day. You'll see initially the patients seemed to be fairly resistant, then they became susceptible, then extremely resistant, susceptible, resistant. What is the mechanism here? Well, we call this mysteries of medicine. Nobody really knows for sure what the mechanism of action is here, but nonetheless, the clinical utility remains. What's the take-home message? Never drop your guard at any time. Whether your patient is on their first treatment or their 21st treatment, each and every treatment carries with it its own independent risk of oxygen toxicity. So what are the manifestations? Well, certainly grand mal seizures are the most dramatic. Patients can also have syncopal episodes. Now, if you are running a monoplace chamber, it's unlikely that you'll ever see a syncopal episode. Why? It's kind of hard to faint when you're lying down. But for those who run multiplace, they may occasionally see the patient that suddenly slumps over, swoons, or goes to ground, and they would recognize that this could be a manifestation of oxygen toxicity. Other manifestations would be gastrointestinal, nausea, vomiting. Then there could be facial manifestations, fibrillation of the lips, facial twitching, apprehension, sweating, pallor. Clinical correlation. Let's say that you have a patient who is on their 4th treatment, and suddenly they complain, I want out. What's wrong? I don't know. I just don't feel right. Is that confinement anxiety or oxygen toxicity? Well, being the 4th treatment, it's unlikely that it's confinement anxiety. For most people, you'll know that immediately. My consideration is that this is oxygen toxicity. What is apprehension? Is it pain? No. It's a patient who simply feels anxious and says, I want out. So it's important as you look at these symptoms to consider the proper clinical interpretation. We also find that there can be sensory manifestations, olfactory changes, gustatory changes, visual field dazzling, constriction, auditory hallucinations, and tinnitus. Now, for many of you with monoplace chambers, you'll have a television set. The primary purpose of this TV set is for the patients to pass the time of day. But a lot of times I like to view these television sets as a crude sensory probe. So if your patient says, I can't see the TV, it doesn't sound right, don't spend time trying to adjust the volume. Ask yourself first, could this be oxygen toxicity? I don't know about you, but in my clinical practice, it's highly unlikely that a patient will say, Dr. Bartlett, I think I'm having a little bit of visual field constriction and a wee bit of tinnitus. So again, it's important that we provide the proper context and interpretation of these sort of complaints. There can also be respiratory manifestations, air hunger, inspiratory predominance, diaphragmatic spasms, or hiccups. Now, these are a lot of symptoms, so let's just do the David Letterman thing. Ask ourselves, well, what's in the top 5? Well, in the top 5, we find that nausea is extremely common. In fact, it's so common that anybody who gets nauseated is assumed to be oxygen toxic until proven otherwise. Something else that's useful to know is that if a patient develops these symptoms like nausea or anxiety, that a grand mal seizure could follow very quickly. On the other hand, some patients provide no warning whatsoever. They may just go directly into a seizure. So how likely is a seizure? That's certainly a question that all of your patients will ask when you go to get informed consent. Well, the likelihood of a seizure really depends upon who you are referencing. For example, Davis published on this early in the 1980s and published an incidence of 1 in 10,000. Others suggest it's 1 in 7,000, and one of the more recent reports suggests it's perhaps as frequent as 1 in 3,000. So typically what I tell my patients, about 1 in 5,000. There can be risk factors that could increase the likelihood of seizures, and we'll take a little closer look at that here in a moment. So what exactly causes these seizures? Well, the current mechanism is that it may be related to GABA levels, gamma-aminobutyric acid. It's one of the neurotransmitters in the brain. The neurons communicate with each other by releasing various chemical signals, things like acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and GABA. And as these little transmitters are sent across the clefts, they send a message, and then the message is eventually broken down. So there's a delicate balance between signal sending and then signal destruction. What occurs for patients in the hyperbaric chamber is that there is an extraordinary reduction in these GABA levels, or gamma-aminobutyric acid transmitters. If we examine the various transmitters in the brain, things like acetylcholine, dopamine, etc., and we look at the biosynthetic enzymes, we find that there is a marked reduction in activity of glutamic acid decarboxylase, about a 66% inhibition. In contrast, the synthetic enzymes for acetylcholine, dopamine, and serotonin are relatively unfazed. Now you may ask yourself, well, why is it that GABA synthase is so sensitive? To better understand that, we have to reflect on the biochemistry of that particular enzyme. You see, the heart and soul of GABA synthase are sulfhydryl groups. As you consider all of the amino acids, there are really only 3 or 4 that have true chemical magic. And the sulfhydryl groups are extraordinary in their ability to pull and maneuver molecules to create new things. What occurs in the hyperbaric environment is under the high pressure of oxygen, we actually oxidize these sulfhydryl groups, cross-linking them. What is that? Well, that's protein denaturation. So here you came into this curriculum perhaps under the belief that oxygen is good and more is better, and now we are seeing an emerging paradigm that we're actually changing protein chemistry itself. And I believe in the future we will probably come to discover that Hyperbaric oxygen continues to have clinical effects, but it may not be for the reasons that we previously believed. And here is an insight into one possible pathway or mechanism, this denaturing effect. For example, we know the reason that some chronic wounds don't heal is because they have a very hostile chemical environment, high in MMPs, matrix metalloproteases. And we know that these proteases are very destructive, destroying growth factors. Could it be that hyperbaric oxygen is actually denaturing some of these proteases, allowing these growth factors to truly account for the healing? At the present time, we attribute most of the healing due to known effects of oxygen producing collagen and so on. But I think it's important in science and in medicine that we always keep our minds open to new paradigms, new concepts that can lead to breakthroughs. Because every breakthrough in science is first preceded by a break from traditional thinking that leads to a breakthrough in clinical practice.